Hello and welcome to this 802 exam support video. Just before we look at the agenda, just a quick introduction to the BSE team. It's myself, David Pye, Rob Malander and Celine Bisram, and our email contacts are on the right hand side of the screen. So today's agenda will include support materials and exam guides, chief examiner reports. We'll then move on to command verbs and responses. Then we'll dig a little bit deeper and we'll deconstruct some of those exam questions, and we'll finish with some hints and tips for learners. So let's make a start with the support materials and exam guides. Support materials include sample and past papers, as snipped on the screen. You can find these on the 8202 webpage. In addition, there are exam guides, further samples, and chief examiner reports. We'll be referring to these throughout this presentation, so you may wish to access some of these before we move on. So what is in the exam guides? There's a separate guide for each exam with important information such as details, content assessed, guidance, and so on, but we'll look at these in a bit more depth throughout the presentation. Exam guide information. This is a really important section and helps with understanding of the questions contained in the exams. It shows how each exam is broken down against assessment objectives. In example 1, electrical, level 3, shows that 44% of the exam comes from AO2, that's understanding, whereas level 2, in this example plumbing, the majority, 48%, comes from AO1. So why is this important? Well, it will affect the verbs and the style of questions at each level. The verbs in AO1, 2 and 4 are likely to be different. Much of the information can be found in the exam guide, again found on the 8202 webpage. The guide includes which units are covered in the exam and a list of learning outcomes. The guide will show how many marks come from each section. So this is really helpful when revising and preparing learners for exams. The guidance goes into more detail, particularly the important verbs. As you can see on this slide, we have a list of verbs and their explanations. We will identify some of these in more detail a little later. Chief Examiner Reports. The reports are very useful in understanding grade boundaries and how well learners have performed. A very useful resource for tutors helping learners to prepare for exams. The first graphic here shows a grade distribution chart for the 8202-35 and below shows the actual pass marks on that occasion. To accompany this information, the report identifies areas where performance could have been improved. In this example, it shows boosted cold water storage principles, storage temps of hot water, and so on. Let's look more closely at some comments. The first example identifies that learners missed a majority part of a question, leading to reduction in marks. An important lesson in reading the full question and breaking it down. We look at how learners may do this in section 4 of this presentation. Example 2 refers to an extended response question and points to AO4. Remember from earlier we mentioned this was important. It relates to certain verbs which we can help learners with. Example 3 identifies that learners typically do well in questions that relate directly to practical activities, which is to be expected but can also help us identify the need to add further knowledge to help learners explain. The final example points out the need to read the question fully, something that often catches out learners. If we look in more detail at the questions against units, we can identify key areas for revision and exam preparation. This example is from the 8202 Electrical Level 3. 44% of the marks come from 2 units, 302 and 307. A further 24% of the marks come from units 303 and 304. So 68% of the marks come from 4 units. 15 marks, or 20%, comes from integration across units, which is the extended response question, or questions if broken down into 2. This isn't new content, but content across all units, and will be associated with AO4, meaning 80% of the marks are made up from all other questions. It's natural for learners to look at marks associated with the extended response questions and think they're higher value, so I'll spend more time on these. But if this is at the expense of all the other questions, they would not be applying their full concentration to 80% of the marks. So whilst all questions are important, it wouldn't be wise to concentrate only on the extended response. Command verbs and responses. AO1 recalls knowledge from across the breadth of the qualification. These are likely to be short, lower mark questions. Verbs will likely be state or list type questions that test recall and usually have a separate point per mark. In this example, the verb is list. It does ask for 3 organisations and is a total of 3 marks. The first 3 responses will be taken. So if a learner puts 5 responses, only the first 3 will be taken. If a learner thinks of a better response later, they can cross out one of them and leave their preferred 3. Examples of AO2: understanding of concepts, theories and processes. These are medium tariff question types, such as explain. Often awarded 1 mark for identifying with limited explanation, and then further marks, often available for more depth or explanation. In this example from plumbing, there are 3 marks, 1 for each control. Example answer identifies what it is and how it's controlled and why, which is to allow flow to a circuit. The AO4 assessment objectives are applying knowledge, understanding and skills from across the breadth of the qualification in an integrated and holistic way. They are longer, 6 to 15 mark question types such as discuss, justify or evaluate. This example from Electrical Level 3 uses the verbs justify and evaluate. To answer this question, learners need to know what is expected from these question types. The other examples on the right hand side of the screen show the verb discuss. So imagine discussing this with someone else, which could include describing, explaining and comparing. What are command verbs? I think this is best described as responses the examiner is looking for. It's worth reminding ourselves of the information in the examination guide from earlier on in the presentation and the split across AO1, 2 and 4. Typical examples of AO1 would be list, identify, etc. But let's look in more detail at some of these verbs. AO2 verbs we are likely to come across in plumbing and electrical would be calculate, remember to show you're working out, describe, which I like to think of as being what and how. Some questions may ask for a description of the effects, so just be careful with this. Remind learners to think carefully about the effects, as it's those the examiner would be looking for. We also see explain, which I like to think of as being what, how and why, showing a greater, more in-depth knowledge than describe alone. AO4 verbs differ and expect greater detail and understanding to be demonstrated. We often see the verb discuss. I often suggest to learners that imagine they are discussing the subject with someone else and they need to go into detail to have that discussion and give comparisons if that helps. We often see the term evaluate. Learners consider what went well, what is good, what the weaknesses may be, and relate that to the certain situation or scenario that you find in the question. Supporting learners in deconstructing exam questions. Let's look in more detail and break some questions down. First of all, it should be easy to spot the command verb. A couple of helpful indicators for learners would be the marks awarded and the amount of space left, helping show how much is expected from an answer. There may be some benefit in looking at past papers and checking if learners understand some key terms. In this example from another subject area, it mentions representation. Would learners know this word and in this context? Sample papers help with these checks and learning experiences prior to taking the exam. Now let's have a look at a plumbing level 3 example. It's an AO2 type as a verb is described. It's worth 4 marks and requires a brief written response. So step 1, let's identify the command verb. Step 2, pick out the word advantages and start thinking about what that means, such as what's good about it. There are 4 marks and 2 advantages. That helps us work out it's 2 marks each. Step 3, think and document 2 advantages. Then consider the verb describe and add further detail. In this example, the further detail is brief and references low temperatures. Also note, other appropriate responses can be accepted by the marker. An electoral question example. In this example, the verb is explain. Also, some key words in the stem would be shaver socket, domestic bathroom, and shock protection. Good practice is to read the question a couple of times, identify and think about the verb, and ensure the answer covers all of these key points. There are 3 marks. The example answer shows what it is, isolating, how shock protection works, and why, picking up a point for all 3 sections of the response. Extended response questions are often based around a scenario. This question is worth 15 marks, indicating the amount of detail required in the response. We can see on this slide the question is broken down into a scenario, a diagram, and then the actual question is at the end. Again, it's good practice to reread this scenario and question before attempting a reply. The question uses AO4 verbs justify and evaluate. We have highlighted some of the feedback on answers from the report. 1 to 5 marks were awarded if there was basic coverage of the calculations, very few points were considered, and no conclusions drawn. Whereas higher marks were awarded when all the design requirements from the scenario were considered and learners evaluated and justified their choice. This links directly to those verbs in the question. Our final question relating to plumbing level 3 shows a discuss question, and we have broken this down into a sequence. The verb highlighted in green is discuss, and the key points are commissioning and sanitation. This may sound straightforward, but feedback from the report suggests that learners didn't always relate the actual system to their responses. So first of all, identify that it's sanitation systems, and you are required to consider the commissioning process. Then consider what is involved in commissioning. So viewing the indicative content, we can see visual inspection, soundness testing, performance tests, and so on. Now think back to the verb discuss. We need to consider discussing this with someone. It will require further depth as identified in the 3 levels of response. Level 1 is largely a descriptive response and lacks understanding of sanitation. But for higher marks, or band 3, this shows not only an understanding of sanitation commissioning, but extra influencing factors, justifications, and additional technical terminology. So strong responses would contain further details, explanations of what, how, and why these checks were carried out. Hints and tips for learners. Our first tip: candidates do not have to answer exam questions in any particular order. It's good practice to read all the questions before answering. If you read all the questions before answering, you can then move on to tip number 2, which is rank rating the questions. There may be those green questions that you feel as though you really know and you can answer quite quickly. This can really help the learner get into the flow of the exam by answering those green questions. Tip number 3, candidates should avoid wasting time by repeating the question either in full or in part in their answer. Tip 4, candidates should always attempt every question, even questions where there may not be a lot of confidence around the answer, but there's an opportunity to pick up some marks. And finally, for extended questions, candidates may find it helpful to identify the key requirements of the question and consider an outline of how they may answer it before they actually start to document their answer. So in summary, spend time on exam preparation with learners. Focus on understanding the question and read the question more than once. Be aware of the exam dates. The exam dates are already available. We can share these with learners and we can work towards those exams. And don't treat the first exam as a mock. And pay particular attention to the command verbs. Thank you for listening to this presentation. We hope you found it useful. For further support, please contact your technical advisor or the Technical Quality team. Thank you.